There has been lots of talks in the past couple of weeks that Sony has intended to completely buy out KAKAO, the parent company of From Software, which unfortunately is just in the crossfire of this massive corporation mess, because yes, From Software is a very small portion of what KAKAO owns, as they do control a lot of Japanese media, and we will get into the actual profit splits later on, but KAKAO has reached out to Sony themselves in talks of completely buying out the company, which it was in KAKAO's best interest to be fully bought out, as I assume they didn't want to be a subsidiary, and this was very much confirmed by the CEO of KAKAO himself in this letter, which the fact that this statement was made to begin with just makes this all but confirmed in my opinion, and that's for multiple reasons. The major one being is that it states that Sony sent a letter of intent, which a letter of intent is basically an agreement. There was a price that was set and both parties are happy with it. They're probably just waiting on a couple of things before they sign. Maybe something comes up and it just doesn't really go through altogether. Now the interesting part is that the CEO revealed this info himself, which inherently made the stock market value just skyrocket. Now this does not affect the price of which Sony is going to pay if there was in fact a letter of intent already, but what it actually does do is prevent potential hostile takeovers, which is probably the main reason as to why all this is happening to begin with, because there is the rumor that KAKAO Corporation was intending to perform a hostile takeover. They have been just consistently and quietly buying shares to inevitably own them. Now this is all just a rumor, and to initiate a hostile takeover, you'd think you would try a friendly one first, which I do not believe there were any reports of such. But if this were to be true, this actually does help explain the situation, and it also just gives another reason to hate KAKAO, as KAKAO is a Korean company that does deal with a lot of stuff like communication and media, and there has been many complaints about them in the past, ranging from ruining manhwa and web novel services, them just being terrible to their music artists and employees, and also they have literally performed takeovers in the past as well. Most recently, a K-pop company for almost $1 billion. So basically we're at the point where it's just anything but KAKAO. Sony is just going to have to be the lesser of two evils in this situation. Now, even if the Sony agreements were to fall through, KAKAO would most likely just have to sell anyway, especially with the stock market being as high as it is, because obviously you do want to sell high, but as soon as it inevitably drops, KAKAO is just going to resume and is buying more shares. Now, this could have been prevented if Japanese laws with takeovers weren't so flaky, and with the Japanese yen not being in its best state, it just does not look very pretty. Now, the reason why it's most likely going to be Sony anyway is because anyone that's probably more fitting just cannot afford it. We're talking like roughly $4 billion. And there aren't many people outside of Sony that could probably do this. Also, it's probably in KAKAO's best interest to sell to another Japanese company, and I can probably guarantee that they have been talking about this for years anyway, but Sony has been on a bit of a spending spree recently, and I guess it just wasn't the right time until now. And there obviously is the morality part behind it, as I do believe that Sony does care more about the quality of their products, more so than KAKAO does. I know people might point towards things like CONCORD and fucking Morbius, but that is a small portion in an otherwise good lineup. Now, if the Sony-KADOKAWA agreements goes through, how will this affect From Software? Now, if the talks with KADOKAWA have been going on for a while, I imagine they do have some plans on order, especially because Sony does already own 10% of FromSoft. But if this was somewhat of an urgent move because of the KAKAO takeover, then I don't imagine anything major, especially because they will have a lot more on their hands to deal with than little old From Software, because KADOKAWA does own 70% of FromSoft, but it doesn't even make up for 10% of the profit margin. In fact, the 2022 fiscal year saw that KADOKAWA made roughly 12% off gaming, which this was the year that Elden Ring got released and made most of its money. But as you see, a majority of their total profits come from anime, manga, light novels, as it is do own a bunch of heavy hitters. Now, assuming that all the gaming royalties do come from Elden Ring and other FromSoft titles, which isn't the case as KADOKAWA also does own Spike Chunsoft, but it'll only end up being roughly half of the gaming sales. So at best, FromSoft make up a total of 6% of all KADOKAWA profits. So keeping in mind that Sony is spending roughly $4 billion, it's going to focus more on the moneymakers more so than anything else. Now, that is not to say that things are going to remain the same, because obviously that's not going to be the case. There are a bunch of different things that could happen. Worst case scenario, in my opinion, is that most of their titles become PlayStation exclusive, $70 games, and they force FromSoft to just make sequels or just games they don't really want to make. Now, best case scenario, only a small amount are PlayStation exclusive. They don't force them to make anything they don't want to. They give them a big old budget to just enhance graphics, cutscenes, facial animations, assets, or even just online play. And also they could potentially make FromSoft related anime or even live action movies. So obviously some of this stuff does sound pretty cool, but PlayStation exclusives are definitely not a good thing and probably just ruins the entire thing. Now, one thing that is interesting is that both FromSoft PlayStation exclusives in Demon's Souls and Bloodborne were co-developed by Japan Studios, which was a Sony-owned and founded game developer, but now they no longer exists. And if you didn't know, they did play a big part of the development in both games. In fact, Japan Studios were the ones to come up with the concept for Bloodborne, then they gave it to FromSoft so they could work alongside with them. But now Japan Studios merged with Team Asobi, so they're most likely not going to be involved in their next game. It'll be interesting to see if Sony have FromSoft work with another company of their choosing or not. And if so, is it because they actually want to have some control of what's going on? Maybe, maybe not, but I feel like the involvement of Japan studios helped justify Sony make the game's PlayStation exclusives. But being that they'll just outright own FromSoft, they probably don't need to use another developer as a medium. Now, one thing that I do not foresee taking place is that they just fire a whole bunch of FromSoft employees and just tell them how to make the game, which seems like a lot of people are worried about. And honestly, that doesn't even make much sense because they don't even have a history with that. In fact, all the gaming companies they owned have almost always expressed natural freedom in their games, and sometimes it works and other times it doesn't. Now, there are cases where Sony has been more invested and potentially more involved. Things like Concord and Destiny 2 come to mind. Now, my theory as to why they care more about these games than other ones is that they are multiplayer games. Sony hasn't had their own multiplayer game in a long time, and I guess they want to delve into the microtransaction world because none of their single players have them. So this is probably why they acquired Bungie for $3.7 billion. And as for the reason why Sony is more hands-on with Destiny 2 to begin with, is that it's just not in a good state. They let them cook for a bit, but after poor management and poor game decisions, it forced Sony to step in. And if you are worried that soon as like FromSoft makes their first mistake, then Sony will have to come along and insert themselves, listen to how poorly the game has actually gotten. And I am a person that has played Destiny for almost 10 years, so I can speak on this, but basically it's a game for nobody. The veterans that play the game all the time are sick of the same formula to the point that even having high quality Destiny activities isn't cutting it anymore. As people require a change of pace, this becomes extremely frustrating, especially if the new activities are mediocre and as are the rewards. And as for the veterans that take long breaks, they don't like it because every time they hop back into the game, so much stuff has changed and it becomes overwhelming, and all the old content that they missed out on is just no longer playable as well. And if you're a brand new player, just forget about it. It's basically like impossible to get into. It's laid out so poorly. The gameplay loop is just made much more complicated than it needs to be. And there are also just so many expansions to keep track of and just buy as well. It is just like a big giant mess. But now that their 10-year plan is over, and they did finish off pretty strong with the Final Shape expansion, but Sony does seem to have some plans in order to make it a lot better, and they have made a whole bunch of staff changes with all these let-offs, and some projects have ended up being delayed in this process as well. So if this is the standard for Sony to actually intervene with your company, then FromSoft is going to be perfectly fine. They're obviously extremely good at making games. Any single time they make something is like an automatic guaranteed nomination for Game of the Year. So I do believe that Sony is going to let them retain their autonomy. But yes, overall, this is a lot of speculation, so do keep it with a grain of salt. But I do think it can spawn in some good things, but it probably still is a net negative, as PlayStation exclusives are never a good thing to have due to alienating player bases and PSN just not even being available in most countries as well. But anyway, I just thought to share my opinions on the situation as a whole and just like shed some light on it too, because I have been seeing lots of really like wild takes and opinions out there. So I think we just need to chill for a sec, take a step back, assess the situation as a whole, and honestly to try to come to terms with it as well, because this is most likely going to happen. But if any new information does come out, I might make a follow-up video, especially if the whole deal is finalized. I kind of want to wait until like I hear statements from both sides first until I actually do formulate my own concrete opinion, but hopefully we do hear something soon. But thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you guys around. See ya!